Hi guys, welcome to the full piece tonight. We've brought you to the WW1 Museum down in Hilsey. So I'm joined by
Martin.
and me, H. This is a full piece. You are the paranormal observers. So if you see anything, put your headphones on, earbuds if you're in the States, heads on swivels, look out, listen. We're going to go in, we're going to get a guided tour of the museum itself, and then after the guided tour we will then start going into our investigation. We may take a break in between the film in the first part and then our investigation being the second part. However, by all means, when you meet Charles, the owner of the establishment, really nice gentleman, he's going to give out all the links that he's got. He does coach tours out to the Battle of the Somme and Wipers, or Yeeps as it's called. So stand to, we're going in.
Okay. Right. Here we are. Right, so it's after volunteers. Any volunteers wish to come and take part? Evening, Troy. It's just the inside the actual fortification. It was a fortification back in World War One, World War Two. And this is Charles. Charles is the owner of the establishment. If you'd just like to do a quick intro, Charles, please.
Yeah, sure. Welcome to the World War I Remembrance Centre. This, you're talking about it being a fortification. This used to be an old artillery gun position. So it was built around about 1860, and the guns were down the far side on my left, with rooms for the crew on the right here. And there used to be bastions like this going the whole way across the north of Portsmouth, east-west across the north. And there's a few of them left. And although this is called the Hilsey Lines, we're actually not near Hilsey at all. We're over nearer the Eastern Road side of things.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a little bit about this place, and happy to take you around if you want.
Okay, cool. If you'd like to take point and lead the way.
So when we came in here, this place was completely ruined,
Right.
and it already got a history of having spirits and various noises and bits and pieces going on here. So everything you see in here, bar the original brickwork, we've put in.
Right.
And we're run by a group of volunteers. We don't charge entrance for this, but we've put in the floor, everything.
Right.
So a little shop area over on the left there, and then we've got this timeline, and we're full of stories here, all true stories. And the timeline starts off in 1912, a couple of years before the First World War, with the sinking of the Titanic. And the reason we do that, we get a load of foreigners coming in here, and most people know about the sinking of the Titanic. So we go into great detail about that. But when she sinks, there's an inquiry, and Raymond Asquith down here, he is one of the leading lawyers into the inquiry, and his dad is the First World War Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, who gives the old suffragettes and the women a really hard time, okay? But Raymond investigates the sinking of the Titanic. He gets killed 4 years after the Titanic, and where he's buried out on the Somme battlefield in France, killed in World War One, the grave behind him is an army captain Hargreaves. And Captain Hargreaves is one of the sons of the woman who was the real Alice in Wonderland. And she's buried fairly local to Portsmouth in Lyndhurst in the New Forest. Right. And I think the photograph of her here, about when she's 9, but when she's 11, she goes out on a boat trip with her 2 sisters. And one of the guys rowing the boat up the Thames is Lewis Carroll. His real name's Charles Dodgson, but he uses the pen name Lewis Carroll. And Alice is hassling him, saying, tell me a story, tell me a story.
Right.
And so he makes up a load of weird stories. End of the day, Alice says, can you write those stories down for me? Well, the truth is he'd virtually forgotten them anyway. But he gets a manuscript, writes out loads of weird stories, illustrates it. His mates say, brilliant, you've got to publish it. And that's history. and it becomes Alice in Wonderland.
Right.
Okay? Right. Other things, you've got D.H. Lawrence, the English author, who writes the book Lady Chatterley's Lover in the 1920s, just after the First World War.
Yep.
Well, before the First World War, he married a German student of his by the name of Frieda von Richthofen, and her cousin is Manfred von Richthofen, who gets the nickname of the Red Baron. He's Germany's #1 flyer in the First World War. And it's her
films.
cousin shoots down 80 British Allied planes, 80 Allied planes, before he gets killed on number 81. We also we do a lot about the Antarctic explorers, and we're setting up a new exhibition about them. But it's showing about stiff upper lip, looking after your mates, battling through adversity, this sort of thing.
Right.
Another story is on the battlefields, when the German artillery shells explode, they give off mostly black smoke. When the British artillery shells explode, they give off mostly white smoke. Just different chemicals they're using.
Right.
And when the Brits see the black exploding German shells, they say, "Oh, we're being Jack Johnson." And they're talking about the black heavyweight boxing champion in the First World War, Jack Johnson, an American. And he comes across in 1915 and helps General Kitchener with a load of recruiting.
Right.
Okay. Anna Pavlova, the ballerina, does a load of charity work. And in 1912, there's a group here showing actors and actresses in the very first Royal Command performance, and that's Anna Pavlova. And just along from her is Harry Lauder. Now, Harry Lauder's like #1 in the charts in 1912. Household name, singer, dancer, entertainer. His son John gets killed out in the battlefields of the Somme. And Harry, when he visits John's grave during the fighting, Harry is shown John's grave, and of course it's a fresh military grave, mound of earth, little white cross at the top, and Harry only goes and lies belly down on top of the grave, full length on top of it, with his arms down each side, and he writes in his memoirs, "All I wanted to do was give my son one last hug." Now, we visit John's grave a lot on our coach trips, and the last time we went there, we parked the coach. I'm the first one off. I go across this narrow little road while everyone else is getting off the coach. And I'm standing there on a grass verge looking at this earthy field, just wondering about the fighting sort of 100 odd years ago. And I don't know why, but I glanced down at my right boot, and there, lying in the on the ground right beside my boot, is an unexploded hand grenade from 100 odd years ago.
Right.
And everyone's getting off the coach saying, "Oh, did you put that there for us?" No, I didn't. I'm not even messing around with life stuff.
No pun intended.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, suffragettes, 1913. Now, when the war breaks out, Mrs. Pankhurst, who's in charge of suffragettes, goes to Herbert Asquith, Raymond's dad, and suggests that women ought to be in the factories, but again, he's very anti it. There are a fair number of women working in factories, but it's not generally the accepted norm. They haven't sort of replaced the men in the factories. So Mrs. Pankhurst in 1914 says, "Girls, we've got to stop hassling the men. We've got to get behind them and help them, because if Britain loses the war, there ain't going to be a suffragette movement anyway." So she suggests going to their pillows, taking white feathers out of their pillows. And 100 years ago, if you gave somebody a white feather, you called them a coward, you called them scared.
Yeah, there's a film
and
on
so she says, give blokes white feathers, call them cowards, get them to join the military. But the whole thing gets completely out of control, because what happens is blokes can hardly walk along the pavement without women coming up to them and saying, "Here's your white feather, you coward," but coming from every angle all the time, constantly. And the two stories that we use here, there's a 15-year-old boy walking along the pavement, minding his own business. A woman crosses the road, and before the boy can do anything, she's put a hand behind his head to hold it steady, and she's trying to force a white feather up his nose, and she's screaming at him and shouting, "My husband's in France fighting, why aren't you in the army, you coward?" Runs off down the road. Seconds later, there's an army recruiting sergeant looking at the boy, and I think it's a set piece between the woman and the army. And The sergeant says to the boy, I wouldn't stand for that if I was you, son. How old are you? And the boy says, I'm 15. And the sergeant says, 18, excellent. Grabs him by the shoulder, pulls him in and forces him to join up. And that's like shades of press ganging.
Yeah. Back in Portsmouth.
The
back in
other
the
thing
day.
is, in the trenches, the soldiers' uniforms used to get filled up with lice. They were lousy with lice and nits.
Right.
And so there's a story of a bloke in civilian clothes sitting on a bus in London. Woman on the seat behind him leans forward and says, here you are, you coward, here's your white feather. He takes it, puts it in his jacket pocket, reaches inside his jacket, brings out his army paybook and whacks her hard across the face with it. And he shouts at her, he says, I'm taking your white feather back to my mates in the trenches where we're fighting. He says, the only reason I'm not wearing my uniform is because it's lousy. But if I was wearing it, it wouldn't be half as lousy as you are.
Right, fair point, yeah.
Yeah. So, right, assassination of the Archduke. And if you'll excuse this pun, the choke is, he's wearing a bulletproof vest.
Right.
He gets hit in the neck. All right?
Unlucky.
Yeah, absolutely. So Gavrilo here shoots the Archduke and his wife dead. And this is the whole spark that starts the First World War, a chain reaction off.
Right.
Soldiers at the beginning of the war, no metal helmets. So they're wearing cloth caps for about 18 months. Helmets didn't really come in until 1916, well into 1916. And this is the sort of helmet we're used to, with the rounded top. But before this one, the helmets had a pleated edge going in, out, in, out, in, out.
Right.
We discovered they were pretty useless. So we sell the useless helmets to our Portuguese allies. Here you are, gang, here's your helmets, give us some money. And if you look at photographs of Portuguese troops in the First World War, they're wearing these rubbish helmets. And we had a Portuguese girl work here. She knew about this, and she'd stand right beside us with her arms folded, make sure that I'm being honest with people, telling them how we stitched the Portuguese up in the First World War.
Fair point.
Nothing live, but we let people have a hold of the grenade there. This is interesting because you've got 6 pictures of German atrocities in the First World War. But when you join the 6 together, you end up with the German Kaiser, the German leader's face. Right. And when we have school parties come in, they won't do war pictures, but they do experiment with doing 6 individual little pictures that join together to form one.
Right.
In 1915, the Germans do 3 things that begins to swing things against them. So you've got the sinking of the Lusitania, you've got the use of poison gas, and you've got the shooting of the nurse Edith Cavell. And with the poison gas, the bizarre story is that a week before the gas attack, a German soldier by the name of August Jaeger climbs out of the German trenches, crosses over no man's land in the dark, jumps down into a French trench unchallenged, no French soldiers around, wanders around a bit, finds some French soldiers and surrenders to them. He's a deserter, he just wants out of the war. But can you imagine how he was feeling crossing no man's land on his own,
yeah,
with the possibility of a bullet from either side? Yeah. Now they interrogate him, and the officer, the French officer, knows Jaeger's telling the truth. And Jaeger, all of a sudden, he's so anti his commanding officer, he tells the French which village, which street and what number house the officer's living in the hope the French can shell it. And also, he suddenly says, in a week's time, we Germans are going to be using poison gas against you French. Now, the officer knows Jaeger's telling the truth, so he phones up headquarters in a bit of a panic because the Allies have got 0 gas masks, 0 gas protection. And he says, got this German deserter, blah, 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 and headquarters say, don't worry about it, the guy's lying, he's trying to make friends with you by telling you a load of rubbish. The Germans have signed a treaty promising not to use poison gas, they won't break the treaty. And of course, a week later, all hell breaks loose when they do it. And it takes us a few days to start getting very primitive gas masks made. And we whizzed around Great Britain, gathering in the swimming goggles from swimming baths so the soldiers could wear it to protect their eyes, and cutting cloth masks with tapes that they can use to stop from breathing in the chlorine gas. Doesn't really work, but it helps. Weapons that various people can use. And this unusual one, this is actually a training weapon to teach the guys how to use a bayonet. So in training, when you thump your mate, there's a spring which is just about rusted away inside, but that would pop in and then this pop out again.
Right, gotcha.
So just for training.
Because the bayonets were quite long in them days, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Compared to what they are now.
And with Edith Cavell, she's in her 40s, English nurse in charge of a hospital in Brussels when the Germans arrive, and she doesn't like the Germans and tells them to push off, and they say, behave yourself or else. And she sets up an organisation with roughly 90 people in it, and they are finding escaping British prisoners and helping to get them away, and they're also finding British soldiers who ended up trapped in a Belgian house when the German soldiers arrived, and the soldiers been living there with the family ever since. And she and her organisation are doing this. The German authorities find out, they arrest her, and they arrest about 70 of her helpers, and she doesn't realise that they're after her life. She thinks the worst that can happen to her is she'll get put in jail for a while, being a woman and being a senior nurse, and having helped German wounded herself. And so they said to her, have you been helping prisoners escape? She says, of course I have. And here's a letter from a soldier I helped to escape a few months ago, and I hope he's back in the trenches shooting some of you lot. Not exactly the right thing to say. And the next thing is, how many British soldiers do you think you've helped? And she says, about 250, and that's enough for them. So 7 o'clock in the evening, they tell her they're going to shoot her at 5 o'clock in the morning. And her pals are belting round Brussels, door knocking, trying to get a stay of execution to no effect. So she got up, set her alarm at 4 o'clock, got washed, got dressed, puts on a nurse's outfit with badges of rank on, sits on her bed. Germans turn up at 6 o'clock, put her in a car, take her to a field, shoot one of her friends first, and then shoot her. And they put her body in a little yellow coffin and bury it. And then after the war, her friends, within a matter of days, she shot in 1915, 1918, 3 years later, her friends belt out to the field to exhume her body, to bring it back for a decent burial. And when they dug down to the little yellow coffin, to their horror, they discovered the body of a dead German soldier lying on top of it, a bloke called Ramler. And Ramler, it turns out, is one of the original execution squad who refused to fire on her, and so got shot for his own troubles by his officer and tipped in on top of her coffin.
Right.
We build lots of dioramas and people can get the feel for it, and we've designed these carefully so that, especially with youngsters or anyone looking in the little windows at the side, you get a completely different view of the battlefields. But you start off with the Germans in the east here, and as you head down this gallery, you're gradually heading west, going through different stages of the battlefields. So German trenches first, no man's land, Allied trenches, the different coloured smokes from the artillery fire that I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
The ruined village, tanks. And we tend to copy pictures that we've, photographs that we've seen. So, for example, there's a photograph the French took of a dead horse up a tree.
Right.
So we've put a dead horse in the tree here. So when the youngsters look through the window here, they're usually saying, oh my God, there's a dead horse there.
Right. Gotcha.
On this side, continuing down the timeline, you've got stories of the French, and in 1917 the poor old French mutinied because they'd been getting slaughtered and they'd really had enough. And after the mutiny's put down, when the French infantry are marching towards the battlefields, before the mutiny they used to sing. They're not singing now.
Right.
And at the most they'd either just give the sound of their feet marching along, or they would bleat like sheep, like lambs to the slaughter, and that was their only way of protesting.
Right.
and you've got a map here of the Somme. So the Somme is a river, and you've got Calais and the coast about 100 miles north of here, and the dots are the British cemeteries on that part of the battlefield. Okay, so this is just for the Somme, and then about 80 miles northeast you've got the town of Ypres, or Wipers, as the soldiers call it, yeah. And similar sort of amount of cemeteries there, and cemeteries dotted around all over the whole area. And there's photographs there of some of the cemeteries, and one of them is Railway Hollow, and there's a youngster buried here called Alfred Goodlad, and he was 19 years old, and he'd written his last letter to his parents, and in it he said, "Dear Mum and Dad, the French are a grand nation, really worth fighting for." And he gets killed, put there, and after the war, when the wooden crosses are taken out and the headstones are going in, his mum and dad had those words from his last letter written on his headstone. Red lines, German trenches, Brits on this side, no man's land here, and this little lot goes up to the coast and then roughly 400 plus miles down to the Swiss border. And the lady there is my gran, and she tells me about her brother Edward, and Edward is killed there. And I get, this area now is a preserved memorial park, so I can actually get into the trench where he was when he got killed. He doesn't have a grave, his body's disappeared like a lot of them, but as I say, I can actually get into the trench where he was. And then out of all the coincidences, I get a letter from Germany from a man called Peter Romberg saying that his dad Hermann Romberg had been a German officer in the First World War, and it turns out his dad Hermann is mortally wounded yards away from where my great uncle Edward was. Well, bearing in mind the millions that are getting killed in the war, these two guys are the two guys that I'm most interested in, and they're both killed within spitting distance of each other. Yeah? And I took Peter and a group of Germans out to the cemetery where his dad's buried. And we went through the entrance. The Germans waited by the entrance. I walked across, found Hermann's grave, beckoned all the Germans across, but only Peter came across. 6'6", built with it, aged 81. And he comes across like a giant bear across the old cemetery. And I had moved a few feet away from his dad's cross just to give him room to manoeuvre. And then I realised he wasn't heading to the cross, he was heading towards me. And then I saw the bloke was crying. And he came right up to me, and before I could react, he put his arms right round me, gave me a terrific bear hug, whispers in my ear, "Thank you, Charles," because effectively the bloke had been waiting 81 years for this moment. Yeah?
Right.
And then he produces photographs of him as a babe in his dad's arms in the First World War.
Right. There was about 16 miles, wasn't it, of trenches going up the coast? Was it about 16 miles?
No. The trenches went from the coast down to the Swiss border.